Welcome to the 100th edition of the Frankly Speaking podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European Public Interest law firm. And to mark 100 editions over 3 years and 50,000 unique listeners, a special debate with 3 of our very best past guests on the key issues which have recurred throughout the pod's history on corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. I'm Richard Howitt, and after leading responsible business issues inside the European Parliament for many years, I'm proud to host this and all of the podcasts. And I'm equally delighted to welcome back our guests today, good friends and each making a major contribution on responsible business. First, Filip Gregor, Head of Responsible Companies section at Frank Bold itself, and member of the European Sustainability Reporting Board. Welcome, Filip.
Hi, Richard. It's good to be here.
And next, Rachel Davis, Vice President and co-founder of the Shift Project, the world's leading centre of expertise on business and human rights. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Richard. It's always lovely to chat with you.
And third, Wim Bartels, Senior Sustainability Partner for Europe for the professional services company Deloitte, also a member of the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Board, and coming back after being this podcast's very first guest 3 years ago. Welcome back, Wim.
Morning, Richard. It's good to be back. Good to see you and hear you again.
I'm going to start with a big question. All of us who work in sustainability suffer doubt. Are we actually achieving what we want? Now, I'm personally sure that each of the 3 of you absolutely are. And because we've got a bit more time today, we can go beyond the usual cliches. Filip, first, what change in the world would you say you and Frank Bold are making?
Oh, well, that's a good one. I suppose we're part of the European project, right? I mean, many years ago when Frank Bold was a local organization in Czechia, dealing with this kind of a surge of foreign direct investment, we had a little bit of that third world course, in the 1990s. We thought, okay, well, we can't, deal with these issues at the Czech level, and that's why we decided to build Frank Bold as an European organization. And so I would say, and that's really what we were trying to do, is that we are contributing to building an European, well thought through, let's say, response to all the challenges that are happening. And as you know, I'm involved as much as Wim is involved in building of the European Sustainability Reporting Framework. And I think that it plays a really, really important role that allows us in the business to think through the future. No matter how uncertain it may seem these days, we need that common language. And that's I think, our greatest contribution that has, I would say, global implications.
About that common language, I'm just tempted to ask you why. If you're a European multinational working in global markets, if you're an enterprise outside Europe but trading Europe's single market, why is it so important that Europe has a common language on business sustainability?
How do you want to speak to people if they don't understand your language, right? I mean, it's nobody really knows how to navigate, these waters we're in. And that was always the case, right? I mean, just all throughout the history, we're living in this moment when everything is connected. The global supply chains, the technology development, the markets, and even the regulatory developments. I mean, what the EU has been doing over the last couple of years have really had impact. I mean, China has now ESG reporting rules, and of course, is leading some of the major technological breakthroughs. And that's all the effect of the, I would say, the EU. No matter how EU is now, I would say, confused and lost and so on and so forth. So in this ever more interconnected world, we need to be able to have a common language. We need to be able to know how to measure and communicate around some of these biggest challenges that we're facing, right? Otherwise, we have no chance of addressing them in any kind of a meaningful way. And we can see how the chaos looks like, right? In the 2025 is showing us, what happens when people are not trying to collaborate together on solving some of these issues. And the language is the very prerequisite for collaboration. Now I'm speaking language, but I'm obviously speaking about the way we measure sustainability, the objectives that we are working towards and such like.
Well, we'll come back to that confusion a bit later, I'm sure. Rachel, we've known each other for a very large number of years, and I know the answer. I could do it for you, but I'm not going to. What difference are you and Shift Project making in the world?
I'd love to hear you do the answer for me, Richard. But if you insist, it won't surprise you. But I'll try and explain why we still believe the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights remain so centrally important. And it goes back to the vision of their architect, John Ruggie. As he said at the time they were endorsed, they're about the social sustainability of globalization. And what we've seen in the last 15 years is that that's become even more challenging to address and even more pressing to address, and that the extremes of inequality, of economic inequality in terms of income and particularly wealth disparities that we see are now at the core of major political fights and movements across regions in Europe, yes, but elsewhere very much so too. And they're at the center of the climate change fight as well. Are we going to be able to get effective action or not? Will it worsen inequalities or not? And I think when we reflect on the potential role of the UN Guiding Principles and what we do at Shift, which is a combination of proving that you can implement them with impact, meaning positive impact for workers, for communities, by working with large companies and financial institutions, but also getting them into the core, the heart of new standards, so that these are expectations globally, not just of a few frontrunners. We remain convinced that this is really the most important contribution we can make, alongside many other allies working on these huge issues of inequality and climate change.
One of those allies is Wim. Welcome back to the 100th edition. I don't think I've ever asked you this question. What difference are you making in the world? You and Deloitte, of course.
I was kind of expecting that question, Richard, after the first two. I think I see it as twofold. So first of all, companies like Deloitte, but of course other big consultancies, they I think can really help companies to first of all implement the sustainability targets and aspirations that they set. Secondly, and we see that now increasingly, I'm sure we talk a little more on that later on, is linking it really to what matters most to business at this moment in time. So at any moment, I've been, as you know, in for 2 decades. So 2 decades ago, it was for companies really like, we need to do something about the environment and social circumstances. What is it what we can do to have a somewhat positive impact? And then it moved on to more targets, and now closer to strategy. I think we are now, honestly, in an era, or at least in a period of time, where it is most about resilience. It is most about how do we navigate CSR in this world of many tensions. And that is, I think, where companies like mine can help with that, without that being a promotion, by the way. It's just how I see it. For me personally,
it's the last time you get to do the promotion, but you've done it, so well done. Get good points for that. Sorry.
No, I think for me personally, so as you may know, I'm an accountant by background. The famous accountants will save the world. And to some extent, I believe in that, which is, I think accountants have a role to play to, coming back to Filip's earlier comment, to create that common language, to make sure that the language is also well understood, and that everything that people read companies say is really reflecting the truth and reality. And that is where I have been, for quite some time now, to play our part, if you like, on behalf of the accountants. And reporting is maybe the main area there where you see this obviously, but I think it is wider. Most accountants understand the business of their companies well. They can help companies drive things forward in their accountants' capacity. So, and that is where I intend to and try to have my impact.
So we've heard it's a common language, these big sustainability challenges we have. We can't collaborate to deal with them unless we have a common language. We've heard from Rachel it's about impact, and actually not just applying frameworks, but then making a real difference in the world. And we've heard from Vim it's actually going to save the world. Okay, I think that you've all passed the test in the first question. Now, next we're going to not go backwards on the whole omnibus saga. In the podcast, we've given, I hope, a really good running commentary on what everything means, both in terms of the omnibus and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. If you haven't listened to it, listen to the recent one with Julia and Andreas Rascher that sum it all up brilliantly. What I want to ask is your sense of how companies are reacting to what's been agreed. And what do you think is going to happen in the next phase? We've had all this uncertainty. We've now got a settled position in terms of the European regulation. What is going to be the hallmark then of what happens next? I'll perhaps ask Vim first.
When you ask me what may happen, maybe this is also partly hope. So let's make sure that we split the two. But I think, first of all, with the whole European development, we have, I think, gone back to the essence of sustainability and sustainability reporting. So what I would expect is that companies are going to figure out what I really need to report in a meaningful way. So not to minimize, but to say what I really need to tell my stakeholders, investors, and others. That applies, I think, to the big companies, all the companies in scope. I'm pretty sure there will be also companies that will try and do the minimum. They will say, okay, it's still compliance. For me, it's still compliance. And Filip and I know that is no longer, not at all, the intention of the standards and omnibus. But I can see that a number of companies still go there, and this is where expect and hope come a bit together. What I also expect, though, is that with this second round, if you like, and the update, companies have realized that sustainability is something really to care about, and not so much the environmental or the social impact per se, but just the business relevance of it. If I don't act on it, I may face certain risk. I may be behind in the market, or I may come under scrutiny. And that is, and this is really hope, is where I could also see some smaller companies in the supply chain being kind of dragged into it over time. Not all in 2026, the next 3 months, but the coming 2 to 3 years, I would say. I think we should see that happening, and yeah, that is really, as I say, for me, partly expectation and partly also hope, with the business lens always in mind.
I've said on the podcast more than once, I think the European standards in some ways might be seen to set the standard, and for those companies that are not in scope, they might choose to reference them, and only history will tell us that. But it's not. That's also whether that's expectation or hope, I don't know, but it's definitely one of them. Rachel, what's going to be the hallmark of the next bit of what we're all doing?
I think the first emotion is relief that we are through 2025. And in fact, if you look at the core of the due diligence duty in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and without in any way minimizing what was lost, because a lot was lost. But as you say, Richard, you've covered that really, really well with prior guests on the podcast. So I don't want to go over that ground. But if you look at the core, the requirement that the companies that are covered have to look at how their business strategies, right, at the heart of the business, how do their business strategies potentially create externalities that they're imposing unintentionally on others. I mean, this is the core, and this remains intact. And this is also the fundamentally, key part of the vision of the guiding principles, which is that we need businesses to have a serious examination of their business strategy. Human rights due diligence isn't something that happens, down the corridor behind a door labeled human rights and no one ever knows about it in the rest of the business. That's what we're trying to avoid. And that potential is very much there. It's obviously going to take good quality guidance from the Commission. It's going to take good quality enforcement from national authorities to get us there. But that's the focus now. That's where we were going to be over a year ago. Okay, we pick that up again now. I think what companies are, if they're relieved by anything, it's that the underlying common logic between the due diligence duty and the reporting duties have been preserved. So they are still the same single common methodology. The EU doesn't talk about it that way. The EU hasn't had a coherent single policy on business and human rights or CSR for about a decade, and that's, I think we see that reflected in the range of legislation, the different terminologies that are used, and the confusion and some of the pushback. But the same underlying methodology is actually there, and it's the methodology in the international due diligence standards. And so companies that have invested in that are in the best possible position now to just get on with it. And in 2030, when this all comes up for review, we're going to have an extremely committed cohort of advocates for expanding the scope of coverage. That's what was, one of the biggest losses in both pieces of legislation. And we're going to just fight that battle all over again.
So it's all happening, but it's going to take a little bit longer. Filip, the next phase, and also how you see companies responding to what's happened.
I'll get to it, but I think Rachel said something really, really important, and it actually connects to Wim's reflections as well. I mean, 2025 was, from the EU perspective, a year of retooling. I mean, if you think about it, every single piece of legislation that was challenged and discussed and so on and so forth is still there. The underlying logic of those tools are there. What has changed is the personal scope, how many companies are actually directly, subject to that legislation. But then if you look at both, let's say, the reporting directive, the CSRD, and the due diligence directive, the CSDDD, I mean, if you look at the omnibus tax, okay, well, that's, the thresholds are insanely high, and that means, only a few companies will be covered and so on and so forth. But then the rest of that omnibus directive is about the value chain, and essentially about what the companies in the value chain, the smaller ones, are supposed to do, what it is legitimate for the big ones to ask them for in terms of information, in terms of screening and so on and so forth. So I mean, ESG reporting and due diligence and risk assessment, all of that. I mean, the omnibus absolutely counts on everybody throughout the economy, throughout the supply chains to do it, just at a different level of standardization and so on. So the Commission basically said, okay, well, it's too much, right, fine, but it's going to be there, and we are leaving it a little bit more to the market to determine that. So in 2026, I mean, we're going to hit it. That's going to be the year when we'll see how it all works together. But sustainability, due diligence, ESG, it all remains, I would say, ever more so important. Now, let me get to the second thing your original question, if I may, and going a little bit back to what Wim said about the hopes and so on. For me, it's not about hope. For me, it's about kind of consequences for business. And I just last week I had a small conference, or a small, I would say, workshop with about 90 Czech business people about these new standards and so on and so forth. And there were two reactions coming from really, really large companies that I think deserves to be mentioned here. One was from, I would say, a very successful industrial conglomerate / holding, which is really progressive, really building up its strength and so on. And they said, we really like these new standards. They allow us to make things more flexibly, and we really think it's a way forward. And there was another reaction by another big company, kind of a little bit more old school. And they said, well, we don't care anymore. We are going to do the voluntary standards, which is just a bunch of environmental and own employees metrics. And that's it for us when it comes to sustainability. But the thing is that this latter company, well, I wouldn't put my money on them being in existence from 5 years from now on. It's a deeply troubled company, actually. I think it's a good, I would say, reflection on what kind of role sustainability plays in business strategy. And if you ignore it, it probably says something about your overall ability to think in future terms, to consider the future risks and so on and so forth. And I mean, some of these things seems to be so distant from the reality of a smallish, large European company. I mean, technological developments in Japan, on the industrial clustering in China, whatever is happening in US and so on, the mining in Australia, and so on and so forth. But if you think about it, all right, I mean, what's the biggest technological breakthrough of 2026? Perhaps the solid state batteries. If they really make it through, I mean, how does it change the story of the electrification of the automobile industry? Well, maybe massively. Maybe all those suppliers in my country, in Poland and so on, they are making all those tiny pieces for the German manufacturers of motors, of engines. Maybe they're going to be gone, right? Maybe they are not going to be needed at all. And so this is all that you need to think through. And if you don't have that language, if you don't actually think through these issues, if you don't apply the standards, I mean, you might miss the train. Right? So it's I'll stop there. But I see I would say a host of reactions to these situations, and the companies that seem to be really thinking through what's coming and trying to understand its uncertainties, they are not backing off this, right? It's the ones that I'm not really convinced are going to exist, in a couple of years, that seems to be delighted by the fact that suddenly, the sustainability is not an issue anymore. The climate crisis is over. I mean, it's a political slogan here in the Czechia and so on, and that's so short-sighted.
That point that you made, that it's not just about whether companies exactly comply or not, but it's a sign of the quality of the management, the quality of the company and its strategy. I hear that a lot from investors, and I have over many years. They're assessing the company's attitude to sustainability as being a proxy, really, for whether it is a forward-looking company. I wanted to ask about investors. I'll do this to Wim. We've had some really brilliant podcasts with investors, right from Marilyn Waite at the start to Robert Adamczyk very recently, Filip Gregor. And they've all been really great proponents that finance and sustainable finance is really going to deliver this change, to the transition, the sustainability transition, let's call it. Your company does investor surveys. What investors are saying to the companies with whom you work. How far is sustainable finance still on track, and how far is the big pushback, backlash, whatever you want to call it, actually existentially threatening the sector?
Yeah, I must say, sustainable finance. I have been involved in the green bonds initiative like 15 years ago. So, and that was a kind of the big promise, right, at the time. This is going to change it all. And we saw a big increase, but we were coming from very small numbers. So then you quickly have a big increase. And then over time, I think it became more and more popular. But I must say that that for sustainable finance, I'm not absolutely sure that what we really want is where we are now. So when we talk sustainable finance, we see the vast majority of investors really being short-term mainstream, right? Just like, okay, if it's good for business financially, then it's fine on the short term. Some, of course, are looking into what you call also the transition. But from my perspective, when we say transition, we don't talk generally about the human rights transition, right? Or the pollution transition. We talk about the energy transition and related to climate change. So a fairly small part, I would say, of sustainability. And in that regard, I see some. Well, we have also, I think, seen some backlash over the last year. Including some of the largest asset managers in the world from the US, saying, yeah, we can't do this for a number of reasons, and we know some of them, of course.
You don't quite name BlackRock there, do you? But you nearly do.
We can. It's of course it's BlackRock, it's State Street. You see them all moving moving away. It's very interesting if you look at it historically, because we have seen them moving from you need to care about climate change financially, to you need to care for your stakeholders, to you need to have proper stakeholder management for the sake of business overall, back to financial performance now on the shorter term. And all of that for me means that sustainable finance has still some way to go, I would say. And again, back to the point I quickly made earlier, when we say sustainable finance, we should not so much define the part finance, but we should define what do we mean when we say sustainable, because from my perspective, that's generally speaking a small part when we say sustainable finance, and that is not the transition we need. That is also talking on the EU, not the transition that the EU is looking for ultimately. Yes, it is an energy transition, but it's also a circularity transition. It's also a social transition, or at least leaving no one behind. So it's much bigger, I'm afraid, than sustainable finance community looks at currently.
I'm not sure if this is hope or not, but when I've looked at this, and I've done it repeatedly, yes, there are fewer ESG investment products. There's a few less ESG investment specialist staff, but the actual amounts of money that have gone into what we're now calling sustainable investment continue to reach record levels. And you talk to people within investment, and they say this may well be just a shakeout, get rid of what wasn't actually good in this, but actually what is good in it is actually going to grow. And we're clearly going to come back to this on the podcast during 2026 with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation revision going through in Europe. So we will come back to that. Rachel, you heard Wim say, feel free to comment on that, but my question, you heard Wim say that social and by parallel human rights are just a small part of the transition as it's seen today. You've made the case in the earlier answers for human rights due diligence. Can I ask you, as I asked Wim, what's the actual state of play of human rights due diligence in the world? How far are companies actually doing it, and what sort of impact are you seeing from that?
One, a quick comment on what Wim was saying, and picks up on Philip's points too. I mean, I think, what the excellent work on the reporting standards has done, again, even though some things have been lost, is to protect that core understanding that your most severe impacts, which is what you're going after when you do human rights due diligence, that your most severe impacts on people, and then by extension on planet, if we're talking broader sustainability due diligence, that you need to get clear about what they are, focus on them, and that they will also provide the essential input for understanding what may be your financially material risks and opportunities from a sustainability perspective. What we clearly need in the climate that we're in is better and more consolidated evidence, that some of which is already out there and just needs to be collected, about that connection between financial materiality and severe impacts. And so I think one of the things that we are excited about at Shift in 2026 is the work of the Task Force on Inequality and Social Related Financial Disclosures, and the potential that that holds, as we've seen with climate previously, with nature, to change the type of conversation, and to get into certain circles that, where there may still be some resistance because this is labelled human rights due diligence, comes from the United Nations, whatever the cause of resistance may be. In terms of your question, Richard, about where are we seeing practice, of course, we're not seeing it where we want to see it, but we've seen, I think, which is everywhere all the time, right? Like the movie. But I think what we have seen is a phenomenal growth, given that this has been primarily a voluntary exercise for about 15 years, with only a few bits of reporting legislation, but not really due diligence legislation until recently, and that has had constraints, as we know, in France and Germany in terms of the models that were adopted. So what we have seen is pretty incredible voluntary uptake by thousands of companies and dozens of governments through policy, if not always legislation, but through national action plans. But the sort of quality of human rights due diligence in many cases has gotten a bit stuck around the assessment, those early phases of assessment, identification, prioritization, which are essential. And we know that they're essential to then, the action that you go on to take, the resources you invest. And I think we've seen, at least in the last couple of years, leading companies shifting out of that and into sort of being much more precise about the action they're taking and then how they're going to evaluate the effectiveness of that action. And that's what is transformational, potentially, about the new EU legislation, that the core concept in the CSDDD is appropriate measures, which means actions that are capable of having an impact on the risks that you're trying to address. And it's pretty incredible the number of times that you hear sort of proposed actions where you can't really join the dots between, well, how is this training program going to actually lead to better outcomes in practice for these workers or these community members or this particularly impacted group? And so getting that into the core of the legislation is just going to massively accelerate the fairly sort of limited focus, I think, that there has been to date on the quality of the due diligence actions that companies are taking. And once we start to get into, the evaluation and the scrutiny of those, not just by investors and lenders, which of course happens now, but by enforcement authorities, then I think you start to see the potential for a really positive and exponential improvement in practice, which of course is the point of human rights due diligence. It's supposed to be, an approach that improves and the bar gets raised over time as we learn that's not satisfactory, that's not making meaningful change.
That's a positive sign. And if listeners want to go back to podcasts where we've talked in detail about how you do good due diligence, the one with Ethical Trading Initiative, the one with Tony's Chocolonely, they're great interviews that we did with them. Now, another theme in the podcast we've had is to look outside Europe, not just inside Europe. And Filip, in the United States, we've seen hot debates about all of this, and we've given guide to that, both at the political level from Bennett Freeman, the former US Deputy Secretary of State, but also in terms of, again, what is carrying on within business and within individual states in the US with Ann Kelly. But you've been looking more recently at a different aspect of what's happening from the US, and I just want to invite you to talk to us a little about that.
I think you're referring to an earlier conversation that you and I had about the, I would say, a certain leitmotif in U.S. diplomacy, if you may call it that, lately. And I mean, everything that Trump is doing is that they are going after power, and that means resources. Like in every aspect of the U.S. policy, there is an aspect of resources, and oil and gas in particular, but not only oil and gas, right? It's just, and we could talk hours about this, but I think already, when was it, summer, when von der Leyen and Trump made a deal in Scotland about the energy imports, committing the EU to import 250 billion USD worth of energy from the US over the next 3 years. I mean, that's insane. I mean, if it would be gas, it means that the EU would have to triple its current consumption of gas. It's not going to happen in the short term. If anything, then the consumption goes down, and even if you put the oil into the equation, it means that 70-80% of the energy imported to the EU would come from the US now, and that's just a piece of the puzzle. If you look at Ukraine and their deposits of rare earth and things that are needed for the batteries and so on. If you look at the Greenland, and especially the deposit of lanthanum and so on, it's just like it's always about that. And I think it reveals one really, really important thing that politicians like to speak about a year ago, but never really acting on it. Never really acting as if it were real. And I would say lately, they don't even speak about it. I think 2026 will be the year when people will suddenly remember and realize it's real. And if you speak to the people from the security world, whether it's think tanks or actually military people and so on, they know it's very, very real. And I mean, the EU is so dependent on foreign energy exports that it's really threatening its independence and existence. We do not want to import 80% of our energy from the US. And just like how would our negotiations over the Greenland go? If we were in such a position, we're already in a very precarious position. We need to get rid of the dependence. I mean, the technological breakthroughs, no matter whether they come from China, Japan, or Europe or elsewhere, is what we need. Is what we need to make Europe stronger and more resilient, and so on and so forth. That is going to bring along a lot of challenges. We need to mine new things, we need new partnerships, and so on. And that's where due diligence plays a really, really, really important role. I would say even more important than in past. But we have to do it, because if we stay stuck where we are, well, then we are exactly where we are. We don't have guts to really push back Russia. We don't have means to push back US, right? And we are not importing these things from, I would say, friendly regimes, except of Norway and Canada and Australia. Thank you people for existing. But the major sources of this are really hostile, to Europe. So it's an economic security inevitability, really, really, for Europe. Or we just accept the submission. We submit, to whoever has the control over these, over these resources. And I had a little bit of hope. And von der Leyen, when she was framing, her new presidency and the omnibus and so on and so forth, they at least paid a lip service to it. They didn't act on it. I mean, lots of the discussions that we have had in the standard setting in EFRAG and and obviously in the legislative process over the omnibus and so on, were really driven by the very particular interests of oil and gas industry. I'm not saying all of that was irrelevant, but lots of it was really particular to that industry. They have had really a sway over these processes, and I was a little bit shocked by that, because Europe's future is a future without these dependencies. Anyways, I think I made my case clear, but I think 2026 will be a year of realization. We cannot go on like that. We have to embrace this race towards transition, because it is in our very core interests.
Good luck with getting the visa if you want to visit the United States, Filip. Just to say to oil and gas companies listening, come on the podcast, talk to us about the energy transition. You're part of the debate, and we're absolutely not against you, but we're are looking hard at what will secure that energy transition. I was watching Wim as he was listening to answer, and he's probably the one that most difficulty getting into any political hot waters. So he was very happy I didn't ask him that question. Now we've touched on all of our podcasts from the US. Can we talk about Asia? Now, Rachel, I'm going to ask you. You're sitting in Australia. The Asia Pacific region well. We've had brilliant podcasts in the last year, showing what's happening in China with Nana Lee, showing what's happening in Japan with the Kikosato, showing the mandatory human rights due diligence law that is going through in Thailand. There's something happening in Asia, and having these sort of Eurocentric or Anglo-Saxon debates on only what's happening in Europe or only what's happening in the US is missing a big chunk of what's happening in the world. How do you define and where do you rate what's happening across Asia on all of these sustainability issues?
Thanks, Richard. And I want to start by acknowledging that while Australia, sometimes likes to say we're part of Asia, we're we're quite distinct, and we're sitting here in the Asia Pacific, as you said, region. So I want to be respectful about commenting on the region from the perspective of Australia. But what I've heard from the government and business and civil society colleagues that we talk to at Shift across the region is that there are a number of really clear reasons why Asian governments are moving on business and human rights. That there are simply it's impossible to ignore the increases in complaints about company conduct that's harming workers and communities. That the governments themselves, and I think indeed Nariluk said this, Nariluk Pachayampon, who's from the Thai Ministry of Justice, said this in your podcast, actually, that the government itself has realized that a purely voluntary approach where only the good students, as she called them, voluntarily report and do the right thing is no longer sufficient. That governments are motivated to generate more benefits for their workers and their communities. And there may be other dynamics in play as well. Obviously, for Thailand, connected to the OECD. For other governments, it's different. In the context of Malaysia, I think there's a strong feeling that there is a need, if rather than just being on the receiving end of demands from EU buyers. That's been the situation for the last 15 years of voluntary practice. And when we went out and talked to companies and stakeholders in the region a couple of years ago to inform the original CSDDD, what we heard was that actually companies are quite sick of getting impossibly high demands from their buyers and then expectations of minimum prices. That still goes on, even from leading EU business. So there's a sense in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Thailand and elsewhere that if we want to actually get to those better outcomes for workers and communities, there's going to have to be some discussion. There's going to have to be some collaboration. There's going to have to be engagement between suppliers and buying major EU and other buying companies about how we achieve that, how they achieve that, and that it can't all just be directions, expectations flowing one way and then complaining when they're not met. So I think
not least because so many of the purchasing companies are in Asia itself. This notion that they're only suppliers in Asia or Africa for that, or Latin America for as much reason, again, is a totally Eurocentric view that we've got to get out of. And if we see this as genuine co-responsibility, which we often say, but then in fact it's a wholly different debate, isn't it? I'm going to drive us on because there's so much still to do, but Vim or Philip, I don't mind who does this one, but we're reporting people. We believe that, and I include myself in this, we believe that if you get companies to be transparent, it will be the biggest motive for behaviour change. And I've been working on that for 30 years. I think Vim probably around the same, Philip nearly that. So we really believe this, but lots of people in companies say we've got it wrong, that in fact there's been so much emphasis on reporting that it's taken away priority towards implementation, and that they say we welcome all of this simplification agenda because it's going to give us space and time to do more sustainability, not less. How do we respond to that?
Well, if I go first, I think these people that say that they are kind of dragged away from the real action by reporting are right, if they use reporting in the wrong way, and that has two aspects in my view. The one is, and we have seen that with the set one of the standards. If you focus on compliance, and you start to get into what is the exact definition of, let's say, carbon emissions, and how do we really go about all the details, and how do we measure the carbon emissions of our offices to the last square meter, then you are on the wrong track. That is one aspect. The other is if you don't connect reporting to your actual management, then you're also on the wrong track. And that is, I think, where these people are right. But honestly, I think what they're effectively saying is we are not using reporting in the right way. We are using reporting to be against these reporting requirements, and then we're done. Yeah, by the way, we forgot to connect it to strategy. We use metrics that we report on metrics that we don't use for management, etc., etc. If you focus on the limited number of topics that really matter to you, if you then say, how can we measure performance, not for the sake of external reporting, for the sake of managing our performance and progressing, then I can't see how reporting is not facilitating the change. And I must say, like Richard, like you, for decades in the space, is reporting really changing the world? If I take the big picture, I'm not too convinced. I haven't seen companies really acting, moving on the basis of reporting. But I think what it does do is it gives a basis for benchmarking to trigger further thinking and to trigger further action. Hopefully, with the updated standards now, we have brought it back to the essence. And I say this always nowadays in one sentence like this: what are your key sustainability issues and how are you managing them? That is what everyone wants to know, and that should also apply to companies within, people within companies who really want to act on this. That is how I would respond to all this.
Philip, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with you, Wim. I think you presented really well, but there's so much packed into that question. And one aspect, though, that I think is really important is that it boils down to the maturity of companies, I would say, ESG integration. No, I heard that ESG is not a term anymore, and people are using something. It's the term. I mean, that's how people call it within the companies and so on. That's why I'm using it, right? Even though I come more from the sustainability and due diligence space. But anyways, if companies that have really these kind of robust systems of integration, sustainability thinking through all they do, including reporting, I mean, you wouldn't hear them complaining like that, right? But the companies who have not, and especially those who have basically treated ESG or CSR or sustainability as a kind of side program and so on and so forth, well, these people are overwhelmed, of course. Because what suddenly, these relatively small teams are supposed to do a big thing. They are supposed to engage with everybody in the company, ask for some data. Nobody's used to that in that company. And these people in those various departments doing often very little projects and not always as important. Some of them are important, as Wim said. Some of them are really reflective of the company's material issues, but some of them are like volunteering for employees and other really good practices, but not maybe material issues at the business level. All of these people are suddenly have to learn how to do reporting, right? And they don't have time to do their projects. So that's really what companies are what they mean when they complain like that. So it's very real. That problem exists, but it's a symptom of a larger, I would say, underdevelopment of sustainability in companies management. So for me, it's a question of the right pace. What tempo do we need in this long run? And obviously, the CSR and the standards were too much, right? Because the companies were unprepared in the same way as they are unprepared for transition. And it's so the question is, how much can we push, right? And I do think, Wim, that reporting is going to change the world. But it's not a question to be asked at the level of individual company. It's a question to be asked at the level of the market. We need that in the same way we need, financial reporting in the financial language, and everything else. We need the same for the science, and so on and so forth.
I think, as well, the double materiality assessment bit of all of this is a game changer. Rachel, you talked earlier about the importance on business and human rights due diligence. The assessment bit, it's where the company learns, and it's where it works out what matters. And I think I'm extremely optimistic that when we look back in history, the double materiality concept and the assessment is the key step forward at this stage. And time is running against us. This is cheeky, I'm going to ask you your favourite one of the 100 Frankly Speaking podcasts and why. And it's about a minute each. I'll do Rachel first.
Thanks, Richard. I already mentioned that I really enjoyed the one that Nariluk did with you. But if I can throw another in the mix, it would actually be the session you did with Heidi Hautala, reflecting on her 3 decades in the Parliament, in which she also called you the original ambassador for business and human rights, which I thought was a very nice and fair compliment. But
Very, very
it's hard to choose. There's been so
very
many.
Finn.
I very much liked the one you did with Chris Coulter and Mark Lee, which was about whether sustainability was facing an existential threat, and I was intrigued by the results from that survey, but also, and we discussed on it briefly when you asked Rachel about Asia Pacific, about the big developments we see in the world where Europe has been seen as leading for decades. We may still be with the regulations that we have been discussing in this podcast, but when I also heard that podcast again, the fact that Asia Pacific may be moving much faster than we ever can imagine, it also made me think that we are not in a phase of existential threat, but we are in a phase of the next story on the same topic, I would say.
Thanks, Philip.
I like most the all the episodes about the world outside of the EU, and I think this we call them internal and geopolitics ones. And I hope you'll be doing more of those, Richard, in the in 2026. But the one on the situation in Thailand in particular resonated with me as well. With a couple of colleagues here in Frankfurt, and just to better understand why Thailand is adopting due diligence legislation. This is such a profound issue for us to understand, because we tend to see the world from our perspective, and that's natural. And I think that Europe has the EU effect is very real, no matter what we think now about it, and that the world has really started to move because of the EU. But it's moving in its own way, based on its own motivations, and for us it's so important to understand those motivations. I think what Thai are doing is very, very smart, including because the CS-DDD, the due diligence directive, actually says that the fact whether a company is under a due diligence regulation or not is a risk factor. So it's just like the tech companies can say, well, we're good, we're under due diligence legislation and so on. But it's again a little bit of the EU perspective on this. I mean, they've got all kinds of other reasons and motives, and it's so important for us to understand how the world is working, if we are to set the right course here in Europe.
Thailand, Korea, Japan, Colombia, Brazil, due diligence is spreading the world, and we're going to carry on covering that and understanding it on this podcast.
And sustainability reporting, especially that risk perspective, that too.
Whether I'm allowed to have a favourite one or not, I'm going to play the game, and it's the one with Elena Varova from Ukraine. She talked about how even in the middle of a war, you could still promote business and human rights. And then she came back, and it was in the wake of a conference she and the UNDP had organised about planning for reconstruction in Ukraine to respect business and human rights. And many of us feel very emotional about what's happening in Ukraine in any case. And in Frankfurt, we have a colleague who's serving in the conflict in Ukraine. But the fact that even in those circumstances, you could still apply the principles of business and human rights moves me to tears. So I'm going to put that one up. Now, one final question to everybody. Sometimes we're accused of being miserable, that we only talk about how terrible climate change is going to do in terms of destroying the planet and habitats. In human rights field, we talk about slave labour and human trafficking and all of the evils of the most egregious human rights abuses. And some people say that isn't a way to get the change we want to see, that we have to be more joyful about the positive side of the changes. And so I'm going to ask each of you, starting with what brings joy to you in the work that you're doing?
A lot, Richard. Fortunately, I think the most joy I take from the work I do is when you see other people, including companies, but also we see it at governmental level, when they call it see the light and they make a change in their mind and then take a small step forward. I'm not looking for the big steps. I'm looking for the small steps. And every time when I'm in a conversation or I'm in a project or I am like with Philip working at the EU level, and you see us taking one small step forward, and go like, yes, that's one step further into a brighter future, and that gives me joy every time again. Nice
Light
question.
bulb moment. That's a brilliant answer, Rachel.
I haven't yet met anybody who's not interested in positive impact and positive outcomes, right? There's no one who's going to say, no, I don't want more freedom. No, I don't want more dignity. So I find that because that's ultimately what we're talking about is outcomes and how do we get there, that everybody gets engaged and energized by that. Then comes difficult discussion about choices and approaches and cost and so forth. But it's not hard to find that shared motivation, especially if you can be flexible with the language that you use and recognize, as Philip was saying, that people come from very different places on this. They come with their own motivations, and you need to try to meet them where they are, and see how you can find that common outcome focus.
Philip.
I really enjoy those moments of common understanding, and I think when we had quite a few within the Sustainability Reporting Board in EFRAG. I mean, in 2025 we work on the new version of the standards. I think the result is really fantastic, and it was a lot of work, and it was really exhausting. But at many moments there were people coming from a very different backgrounds, just kind of coming to an agreement on those things, and it was really encouraging. And the second thing, if I may say, if I may add it, Richard, is that I'm really fascinated by those technological developments and breakthroughs. And just last week I already mentioned that there was news about Samsung entering basically into the final phase of its solid state battery development. There are several other such developments on this, and it's such a massive game changer, and it's always really fascinating, thinking through how this would change the world and how quickly the things can change. And then small things like when people are proud of their local protected area or stuff like that. I mean that's really what people connect to emotionally, and so on, and or a decision. Okay, let's extend this natural park a little bit, and so on and so forth. That's how we need to. That's how we need to be thinking about sustainability, not just about the market change, but also about the real world, real landscape, real environment in which we live. And I think that makes things so much more enjoyable for everybody, and so much easier for everyone to connect, with the very essence of it, which is the world we live in.
And on the podcast, we'll carry on covering those latest technological developments, and we'll carry on trying to link what we're talking about in sustainable business with local communities in the way that you've just described. This is going to sound cheesy, but if I'm going to say what brings me joy, it's working with people like each of you. You're great friends, and we've toiled together on some difficult stuff. And the truth is that the three of you represent a huge number of people in like-minded organizations and work, and we are a movement, we are a network that work together, we support each other. We enjoy the good times, but we live through the bad times. But there is a real feeling of common endeavour. And if I may say so without being over ambitious, we hope that is very well represented in the community of listeners who subscribe to and listen to this podcast. I think we've created a real community here. It's brilliant, the number of people who send in comments and suggestions and ideas. I'm pleased to all of you listening, carry on doing that. We have reached the end of our time. I hope that all of our listeners have enjoyed this special debate for our 100th edition. And to Filip Gregor, Rachel Davis and Wim Bartels, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
so much.
Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Congratulations with 100, and I would say up to another 100 episodes of this great podcast.
And more. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our LinkedIn page, and where you can also give comments about this debate, and you can do that as well via your podcast provider. We hope you will share this conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again so much to Rachel, to Philip, and to Wim, and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.